Greetings. Hello, everyone. Welcome to November. And, increasingly interesting world. Definitely a lot going on. There seems like there's the psychic vibrations have gone up a notch or two in gnarliness. Um, and as always, once we get to the second half of the evening, when we open up the Q&A, we can really talk about anything. And just as a reminder to folks, especially if you're new, that while I record my introductory talk and the meditation we'll do, we don't record the Q&A just to keep it nice and intimate and allow people to have a little more freedom to talk about whatever. I like to think we can talk about pretty much anything on this in this zone. So yeah, welcome. Well, what's been going on? Um, I just wanted to mention that I s- we started a monthly psychedelic gathering, a salon at the Alembic, which is the meditation mutant meditation lab or center that I co-founded with some friends a year and a half ago. And that should be fun. We thought it would be like, we didn't even really put out too much of a word, and then we got like totally sold out. There were all these characters, and it was very interesting, but it's clearly a hot topic, or at least I don't know what exactly people were looking for, and we'll be posting that stuff online eventually. But it was exciting. It was good stuff. What I wanted to talk tonight about is, or I wanted to start off talking about the idea of risk and the related idea of the edge, and particularly your edge. And I think they're two related ideas, but one of them is riskier. And even the language we use around risk and edge are a little bit different. People often talk about like finding your edge, whereas I think risk needs to be kind of kept as risk. And the question I had, and I was asking a friend of mine, and we were talking about Tantra. So in India in particular, but really throughout the South Asia, starting around 700, 800, what we call Tantra really got rolling and kind of was sort of the dominant religious tone, both in Hinduism, so to speak, and in Buddhism for many centuries. And there's a lot of ways of characterizing Tantra. I'm no expert. These involve lots of magical technologies, mantra, visualization, relationship with God, sort of things that are kind of like almost getting possessed by deities, but being transmuted into sort of different ways of relating to deity. And within Tantra, there's a kind of left hand tradition, as they refer to it, and the left hand being uh, the sort of shadow or disruptive or sort of challenging approach or side. And for left hand tantrikas, they actively subvert social norms. So, for example, in traditional Hindu society, alcohol is no bueno, but they'll drink alcohol, or they'll eat cows, which, as you know, are sacred in India, and people don't eat them. So the idea of there being sort of social norms that are deliberately transgressed is a really key element inside Tantra. And it's an interesting thing to think about. And I mean it not just in an abstract history of religions way, but when we think about our own spirituality and our own seeking, our own movement towards awareness and love and light, is this question of transgression, but particularly the interesting relationship between transgression and the fact of a social norm. Because um, if there is spiritual power in transgressing by eating beef in a culture that doesn't eat beef, it clearly does not have that spiritual power if you're in a culture that eats beef, because you're not really transgressing anything. It's not about the beef, right? So this sets up very interesting stuff. And there's actually a lot of really cool anthropological material about this where, in a way, all human societies create structures. They organize the messiness of life in a variety of ways. And one way is through categories, and particularly categories of like allowed and not allowed, and things that are good and things that are bad. But of course, all categories are a little bit more complicated than they might initially look like. And so there's always problems with these category lines. And there's a certain kind of power, and it's specifically the term power is a value here. It's a very important term in Tantra. And I think it's an important term in spirituality, which we don't always know what to do with. Because power, you don't want to have power over people. It should be goodness and love and light. And you're like, yeah, but power's part of the picture. Power is certainly part of magic. Um, so these categories that organize the world kind of offer themselves to these sort of transgressive gestures. And I'm gonna bungle it. There's a famous study by Mary Douglas, who's an anthropologist, about I think it's called Purity and Danger. And there's a question in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, in Deuteronomy. There's like these animals you're not supposed to eat, and people are always like, "What's wrong with these animals? Like they're eating these animals, they're eating those animals. How come these animals are like forbidden?" And one of the ways of looking at it is that there's certain kind of animals that combine or cross categories. So it's like they look like horses, but they have different kinds of hooves. And the animals that have these kind of hooves aren't the horse kind of animals. So, that kind of thing, like the way that people categorize the animals, it creates these category ruptures or blocks where there's a certain kind of power where things are forbidden. But then if you invert that and then embrace the forbidden thing, well, suddenly there's a real power there. There's like a real power to transgression. Now, things are really different in the modern society because in modernity, there's a pluralism of different ways of organizing the world, and everybody kind of knows that. And if you grow up with anything like postmodernism or any of these more modern ideas, you kind of know that all laws are sort of, constructs. They're not because God said it so. It's because somewhere along the way, somebody said this is the case. A lot of things don't quite have the edge that they do, but some things really do. And that's why we see a lot of energy around them. For example, if you go back and you look at Bohemian cultures for the last 150 years, what is one, so these are groups that are consciously living on the edges of society. They're living in garrets in Paris, or they're traveling to Tangiers in the 1950s, or they're getting cheap flats in the Haight-Ashbury in the 1960s. And, these kinds of communities, what do you see? What's one of the things you notice about that? Well, they often have a lot of weird sex, and they often do drugs. And like, well, what's that about? Is it just because they want to have these experiences? No, part of it is because though there are very strong social norms around intoxication or madness and also sexuality. And so the edges of those norms have power as a place to play. So it's not just that you're exploring your desires or you're being creative with your sexual relations. There's actually a kind of transgressive power which the early tantrics recognized. By breaking the law, you actually release somewhat dangerous power, meaning that it can fuck you up, it can get you in trouble, And the fact that it can get you in trouble is partly why it can fuck you up, and partly why it's exhilarating, liberating, transformative. It actually kind of releases energy that can itself be used for various purposes. So it's not just about like transgression for, certainly in a tantric context, it's not about transgression just to be wild and woolly, although you suspect that some of them were kind of like that. It's also to explicitly gesture towards a mode of liberation or a kind of freedom or a kind of power that's all, it's never going to fit within the constraints of conventional society, that's always more transcendental or more outside. So this raises a couple of kind of interesting things that I've been thinking about lately. One is this question of psychedelics and the power within psychedelics, because I think that while psychedelics can do and be many things for many people, one of the reasons that they have been a potent part of people's lives is that they bring in a quality of magic, of power, of non-ordinary relationships or non-ordinary ways of being in the world that are exhilarating and powerful and a bit dangerous. We all can note elements of danger, maybe even in our own experience, and certainly we've seen what's happened with people. And these are both internal dangers, the danger of believing your wildest visions, the danger of losing the plot or going temporarily nuts, the danger of getting in trouble, the danger of jumping out of a window, of getting in very difficult situations. But one of these dangers is, of course, getting busted, right? And that's what's really kind of an interesting thing to think about, that in a society that officially denies these elements, associating them with marginal people, trying to control them, and then trying to prosecute people who stand up for them or who buy, sell, and take them, that you create a kind of modern version of one of those social norms where it's the law, right? And so now we have a very concrete sense of like breaking the law, that being an acid dealer on the road following the Grateful Dead in the 1980s was kind of available as a possibility, but it was also actually risky because you could get busted. And many people did get busted. And in fact, because of some of the screwiness of the laws in the 1980s and the 1990s, people could get busted with relatively small amount of LSD, but if it was on paper or on pills, they could go away for enormous periods of time because they were sentenced based on the weight of the carrier as well as the drug. So you'd have people going away for, like whatever, like a gram of acid, but it was on pills. And so boom, you're like 25 years in jail. And so there's a lot of these guys who are still in jail. And one of the reasons that we want psychedelics legal, one of the main ones, one of the supreme ones, is to like stop that from happening. Get those guys out. Don't run that risk anymore. And the difficult thing to talk about is that while that's totally true, and if I could press a button that says, make these things, at least decriminalize these things, or keep the regime of terror that is the drug war, of course I'm going to press the decriminalization button, just for the fact of not immiserating people. And yet, and this is the difficult thing to talk about, there's something positive about the criminal regime. And there's two main things that I would say are, well, there's two or three, depending on how you do it, that are positive about it. One simple one that we can already see, even though psychedelics are effectively still scheduled, they're still basically illegal in most places. Yes, there's cracks in Colorado and decriminalization movements in certain cities and Oregon, and mushrooms are probably going to be okay, whatever. Things are changing. They're changing rapidly, and they almost certainly will continue to change. It's not guaranteed. We don't really know where we're going to be in 5 years. We might have fascists in the White House in a year. I mean, it's a crazy world. Who knows? But one thing that we can say for sure already, based on what we're watching, is that like capitalism and psychoactive drugs are kind of a weird, not very pleasant marriage. And that one thing that was nifty about illegal drugs is that they weren't part of capitalism, or at least that aspect of capitalism. Sure, there's ways to analyze how people made money as dealers and underground, and there's, it's ultimately part of the same sort of economic framework, but in a lot of ways it's not. And particularly in terms of how venture capital works, or and the return on investment and shareholders, and then all the stuff about advertisement and marketing and market share and competition and manipulating scientific results in order to format your product, and outgunning the other guy when coming up with some new compound so you can patent it and make more money off of it, even though we know that the old unpatentable drug was perfectly good as its own. All sorts of weird ways of gumming up the works are prevented by the substances being illegal. So that's one. And then the other one has to do with its kind of, I guess, tantric potential, that in taking psychedelics, and again, this is still kind of true, but also kind of not true, because of even just the mainstream discourse around psychedelics has changed so much, even if the laws haven't changed as much. But in the past, in earlier decades, to do that was like basically to just sort of embrace to some degree the identity of being an outlaw. And this meant not just like, well, this meant a couple things. One is that there's a kind of fellow feeling among outlaws that is different, as a kind of subcultural glue, because you are actually mutually running a risk. So I'm an acid dealer, I'm selling to kids in the parking lot, I'm paying up to I got to get it from my guy, and I got to be careful, and then I know the cops have been, that creates a kind of network. It creates a lot of conflict as well, and ripoffs, and abuse, and all sorts of things. This is not a romantic picture. It's just talking about different kind of qualities of energy and subjectivity. So it creates a kind of subcultural density that has an initiatory character, something that I think a lot of us all yearn for wherever we are in our world. That the idea of a social world that's kind of hermetic, that we find our way in, at least in my generation and the generations before. This is a really significant kind of feature that's just just lost when it's just all available, it's all online, and I can do this thing and get this thing, whatever. You don't get that kind of tribal force. It's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing. It's just it's worth noting the difference, because one of the outstanding questions then is like, how much does the liberatory potential of psychedelics partly depend on its cultural framework? How much does actual risk, and then there's other kinds of risks that I want to talk about, but just talking about the legal risk now, how much does actual risk in some ways inform the power of the experience? And of course, this risk isn't just legal, that's just the obvious one. Then are some of the other ones that we've already mentioned that are still part of the picture. These are risks, and some of these risks are going to be just as powerful, if not more, in a more legal regime. There's, again, the risks of your own psychological breakdown, the risks of an experience of madness, the risk of psychological inflation. And then there's all the risks with the people who are organizing the experience for you. I'm sorry, guys, it doesn't matter whether you're talking shaman, a psychotherapist, a doctor with a lab coat, a nice researcher in the lab, whatever. All of these power relations, and that word power again, are potentially abusive. And we've already seen some very strong, abusive relationships that have really hurt people in the underground, in the overground, and that problem, particularly when you add psychedelics into the situation, I mean, it's bad enough just with the shrink or other kinds of experts. When you add psychedelics in the situation, there's a real risk there. And while most of the discourse has been about how do we prevent this from happening, I believe, and this is a risky thing to say, but I believe that risk is part of the picture. Risk is part of the picture. We can mitigate risk. We can develop ways of putting the risk where we want it to be versus places where it's more dangerous or less in our control. But the idea that we can create a risk-free psychedelic, or frankly would even really want to, which although I don't know what that would mean, is to me questionable. This gets into a much larger question that we can talk about later on, just about the status of risk in general in modern society and how there are certain zones where wild risks are not only accepted but applauded. Extreme sports is a great example. Nobody really thinks the state should intervene and prevent people from from base jumping or whatever. I mean, it's like amazing, and it makes great YouTube videos, and they're heroes and whatever. But there are other kinds of risk. Drug risks are some that are seen as really quite negative, and then there are particular kinds of risks that I think are worth mentioning, both in terms of psychedelics, but also of spirituality in general. And those are precisely the risks of these weird power relationships. These weird power relationships with other people, with other scenes, with other stories, with other narratives, with other practices. Cults are a risky operation. Like I sense when I'm like, no, I'm not going in there. There might be something appealing about it. Clearly, it's appealing for a lot of people. They're not just dupes. Some of them might be in over their heads. Some of them might not know what they're getting themselves into. But some people have a pretty good idea that, like, Rajneesh's commune up in Oregon is a pretty wild and fucked up place. Let's go check it out. And some of those people get hurt and some of them don't. And it's a weird thing to talk about because it's actually risky and people actually get hurt. But that's also true with base jumping. But that's okay. And the other thing is not only not okay, it's like actively avoided. And I don't have a solution for it. I'm not saying these things are equivalent. I'm just noting that there's something very nebulous about our idea of risk, and that the way that our society is constructed now, where a lot of people are very concerned with all manner of risks, particularly inside power relations, sexual relationships, with professors, with sexual partners, da da da. There's so much emphasis on like the danger and the need to be safe, which as a Gen X person has something that I've never gotten used to, is the kind of demand you find in younger generations for a feeling of safety. Like, I'm not going to be safe in this class unless I know that I'm not going to be confronted with objectionable material. Like, my brain cannot accept that. And I realize I'm a white, male, privileged person from a certain generation. I'm not trying to say I have a superior approach. I'm just being honest that will never make sense to me, that kind of holding of safety as this overwhelming value. And I say that as someone who's been very blessed to live in a very safe situation. And I'm not talking about the tons of real physical dangers and, very, very abusive situations that people are put into. I'm just talking about the value, the social value of that safety has achieved. And so it seems to me like it's an interesting place to think about risk. So just a few kind of more positive points to think about is that what I'm kind of offering you is to think about, regardless of how you stand about any particular zone of risk, extreme sports, cults, creepy psychotherapy, whatever, is that we all have zones in our life where we take risks. And the risks might be small compared to the base jumper, but for us, they're not small. And it's actually, I believe, a really good practice to begin to recognize and play with risk in our own lives. And that's where this kind of similar but different idea of edge comes in. Because while risk is really risky, and I think that there are reasons to be risky in specific cases, depending on who you are, what you want, what your opportunities are, I really think we can all benefit from getting to know our own edge. And it's similar but different. And part of what makes it different is the edge is something that you know. You know, the scary thing about risk is that you don't even know what the risk is, and then there you are, and it's too late. You know, you're in. But the edge is more of a self-determining process where you're like, what is my edge? Where am I? Where do I get afraid? Where am I uncomfortable? Where do I feel unsafe? Where do I feel unsafe? Not what is unsafe for other people that we need to fight about, but where do I feel unsafe? And get to know that edge and play with it. Play with it in a small way, maybe sometimes play with it in a big way. And psychedelics, I think, are really wonderful this way because they come with their own edge. It's like I can take, whatever. I went to a party and I took a gram of mushrooms and it was fine, it was sweet, great, whatever. I had a little bit of a flutter once or twice that was a little weird or something. But if I had been on 3 grams, then I would have been a bit different day. But if I had been on 5 grams, then I really wouldn't have been kind of dealing very well. So just the fact of dosage gives you a kind of edge. And even certain kind of substances can be I still find DMT to be terrifying. Like I'm just flat out. I'm like, I don't want to do that, and I only do it by just like, okay, you're that kind of weirdo, and then afterwards I'm happy I did it, but I still don't feel like I've really kind of gotten it. And I know people who seem to have gotten over their edge much more. I'm not a hardcore psychonaut that way, I don't think. Or at least I'm more honest about my fears. But that I think one of the reasons that people are so drawn to psychedelics is that even though they say that a lot of people want a situation that's really safe or as safe as they can make it, and I support that. I think a lot of people coming into this space who don't have a background in adventurous lives, in bohemia, in criminality, in excess, actually probably should be about as safe as they can be when they enter into the zone, which means moderate doses, very contained and controlled environments, excellent therapists who are very supportive, the whole kit and caboodle. But I think that on a deeper level, let's say a social cultural level, part of the reason that people are so attracted to psychedelics now is they sense, rightly, that here is a place where I discover my edge and I'm either seduced or sometimes forced beyond it. And that there's a fundamental value in that. They may think they're going in because they want to solve their psychological problem. But I think that on a deeper level, there's some sense that there's still a way that psychedelics escape a certain zone of control and self-consciousness and organized social forms that seem like this is a direction of life. This is a direction of encounter. This is a direction of having a personal relationship with the unknown and with the limits of my own comfort, the limits of my comfort zone. Looping it back. And I think that this is something that you can also bring into your meditation, contemplative practice or whatever, that it's not just about psychedelics. It's just more obvious there. And it can be in a very, very subtle way, but getting extremely in tune with where you're uncomfortable, where you're stressed, where fear comes in, and become interested in that. There's something in this social situation that I feel the fear of. Why, what is that flavor? What is that element? How do I live with that degree of anxiety? So it's a way of kind of claiming back these situations that we all have, and especially now because the world's so fucked up, of where we're facing fear and facing anxiety about the macro situation, about our own situation, about the future. is to start to befriend these things. Not that they're happy-go-lucky, like, "Ooh, so I'm terrified about the future. Woo!" That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about befriending it in the mode of like, all right, this is not only part of reality, this is not only part of the human spirit, but it's actually an invitation to get to know and even to grow into and beyond the edges that I think I have. So when we, doing our sit, I'm just going to gesture in a few kind of directions of these edges, and they're really subtle. It's not a big scary thing. It's just about recognizing that there are little forms of these limits, little form of these edges, and little risks you can take every day that you take in the mode of risk is actually a way of becoming more and more comfortable, stronger, more confident, but also more aware of the kind of richness of these edges around our comfort zones. So with that preamble, let's try let's sit for half an hour or so. Um, uh, so find your seat. You know, as always, I encourage people to settle in a way that allows your back a lot of free range of movement, not to lean back into your chair, and take advantage of that movement of the spine and of the back to find just a very beautiful balance point where your hips are spilling forward, so there's a nice curve in your lower back. There's a nice curve in your spine as your chest opens up, a kind of hollow in between your shoulder blades, just gentle, but enough to feel the sort of serpentine shape of the spine. And then finally, tucking your chin just a bit so the top of your head is like there's a string attached just back to the fontanelle area of your skull. And your neck is a little bit opened up and flattened. And this posture, this kind of S shape in the spine, is a really beautiful one to work with. And again, you can find it by sort of slightly swaying around like a tree in the breeze, and kind of just intuitively finding that shape that feels the most balanced, like you're balancing, a stack of 15 plates on your one hand, and you're like, okay, yeah, that's about right. Okay. So you're always sort of keeping a little bit of element of dynamics, but also of settled strength and uprightness. So within this frame, allow yourself to relax. Just breathe. Don't force it to be any one way or another. Just check in with how you feel. Let it be the way it is. Allow the breath to let your mind slow down. If you're feeling lots of busy thinking, energies in the body, restlessness, just invite them to ride the breath as it exhales your body. As you settle in the exhale, all of that extra energy just calms down. Sometimes it's nice to imagine the sort of center of your energy descending from the head, where we keep it most of the time, down through the throat, through the heart, through the belly, and into the bowl of the pelvis. And that sinking energy, accentuated by the exhale, is a beautiful place to put restlessness, thinking, energetic intensities. So let's just settle here for a bit. Follow your breath in and out, and then pay particular attention to those moments after the exhale before the inhale naturally begins. No need to intervene, make the breath do anything. Just be with that cycle and allow yourself to fully relax at the exhale. What happens to your mind when there's no breath there? You inhale, feel the breath in the nose, in the throat. Exhale, reverse movement. But then there are those moments. Where does your mind go? Can you rest in that pause? As we continue to breathe, that pause might grow in time, become even more settled. Recognize that in those moments, nothing's really happening. You're not really breathing at that point. It's as if there's a kind of stop, and then the breath starts. Tune into the muscles around the diaphragm, and as much as possible without intervening, become aware of the feeling in the body as the inhale begins, as you move from this vanishing point of stillness into the action of the in-breath. Where does the movement originate? Is it your nostrils, the diaphragm, the chest? And now, what I invite you to do is in that pause, to whatever way seems most natural to you, hold that pause a bit longer. I could call this holding your breath, but that tends to mean a specific way of holding breath in your lungs and of kind of clenching your throat. And if that makes sense, that's fine, but there might be another way. And all you're doing is just slightly extending, very small amount, just a moment or two. So we'll spend a few rounds here breathing. And again, at that pause at the end of the exhale, just stay there for longer, just a moment or two or three. We'll do that for a few rounds. Keep it very subtle so that when the in-breath comes, it's not like a jump or something tense or something, oh, finally. You're just sort of leaning in to extending that pause before the inhale. But let the inhale be as natural and smooth as possible. Now you can bring your throat into the picture. So here you are, I'm inviting you to very slightly, for a very brief time, hold your breath, meaning allow the exhale, rest in the pause, and then as you extend those moments, note that at a certain point it becomes easier to do if you block your throat in whatever way you naturally do that. If I just asked you to hold your breath underwater, you'd have that sense of like, oh yeah, I just closed the gap. Very subtle. You're not clenching, you're not gripping, but you should be able to sense it. And do that for a few cycles so you get used to that subtle process of uh, holding the throat closed. In yoga, you call this a lock or a bandha, and we're not doing it in the yoga way. There's a whole sophisticated way of doing a lot of these breathing techniques. In pranayama, we're just keeping it real simple. And notice that when you close your throat, at a certain point, you open it up again, especially if you want to keep the in-breath smooth, which is the goal here. Watch that moment. When does it happen? Who decides? At a certain point, you just begin to breathe again. Now, what I'll ask you to do is to intentionally keep the throat closed until you begin the bare shiver of discomfort. Oh, I'm not getting enough breath. And you'll notice that even though you're not really holding your breath for very long, if you're meditating and you're being very subtle with your attention, you can see and or feel the fear arise, the concern, the energy of anxiety around the breath. And so, what I'm inviting you to do, and we'll all be doing it in different rates, is to, in a very relaxed way, rest in the pause, close the throat, and hold. And don't hold in a grippy way. Don't hold like you're counting the clock. Don't hold like you're in some kind of competition to hold your breath. It's much less than that. And you still want to breathe naturally when you inhale. What you're doing is you're paying attention to the moment when your body begins to signal that it's a little anxious. And you're just getting to know that feeling. And if you feel it, let it go. Let the throat go. Breathe in, inhale. No stress. No anxious in breath. It's just that encounter and a little bit more, and then let it go. You may notice that as you cycle through this, you can extend it, and you can extend it without discomfort. You have found an edge. This edge is malleable. You can play with this edge very safely, but it will illuminate a whole set of fears and anxieties that are held in the body that are related to all manner of experiences we have as we go breathing through the world, as we tighten up in anxious situations, as we get constricted. There's a lot in the breath. And I'll just let you sit with this edge for a bit more. Free divers, diving without scuba equipment, develop the skill in extraordinary ways. And they're holding their breath much, much longer than we are, which tells us that it is, in some ways, a very malleable edge. And the goal I'm inviting you, or the practice I'm inviting, is not so much to hold your breath for longer and longer, though there are some benefits to that. It's more to take advantage of that resistance and that anxiety to work through in a very safe and subtle and personal way your own edge. And now I want you to let go of that practice, but stay with the relaxation. And now we're really going to get relaxed. As much, pull out all the stops, all your tricks. Breathing, settling. If you're holding tension in the face, around your eyes, around your jaw, let it go. At the end of the exhale, it's almost as if you're barely a shape anymore. You're melting into the ground, you're melting into the air. The boundary around you is becoming less clear. So as I relax my body, as I relax my breath, I can also relax the self and the boundary the self makes between inside and out. So if you're feeling good and relaxed, you're feeling in your seat, see if you can gently allow that boundary to soften. The sounds I'm hearing, are they inside me or outside me? If my eyes are at all open, are those impressions inside me or outside me? Find your way to the place where that question doesn't really make sense anymore. You may notice that in this invitation there is some interesting resistance. Please don't get frustrated if it doesn't quite make sense or you're not feeling it, because that blockage is meditation. We desperately maintain that boundary, but it's not written in the nature of reality. It's not our skin. It's an idea. It's a template in the mind, a habit of reference, and all of that can be relaxed. And the resistance to that relaxing is just as interesting as the relaxation itself. How does that resistance come up for you? Where does it stop relaxing? Maybe the sounds you're hearing, you're like, they're happening outside me. But consider that the sounds are happening inside your mind. Or if you're a scientific type, consider that the sound is happening inside your brain and that you're actually just running a virtual reality. Well, where's the virtual reality? Inside? Outside? But again, the point here is not to absolutely dissolve into the entirety of space, time, and matter and consciousness, although that would be nice, if unlikely. The point is to feel into where it stops. And that's another edge. Perhaps the boundary is loosened, but there's still a kind of core sense of selfness, maybe in the mind, maybe in the belly, maybe a kind of energetic vibration, like a flow of current, a kind of hum that keeps you together. Rest in your edge. Don't try to do anything. Just rest in it and allow it to settle. And if you're, again, paying attention to your feelings with this subtle, aware mind, you may notice little glimmers of all sorts of feelings: fear, excitement, pleasure, anxiety, confusion, nebulosity. Not grand terms, but very subtle. That's your edge. You may be feeling pretty relaxed now, uh, maybe very pleasant, warm, settled, calm. And though it sounds counterproductive, I think it's not. Wherever you're at, try to see if you can tune into the fear or the anxiety in the moment. You might not be able to, and that's wonderful. But you might see that even in our pleasant states, there's a kind of edge, a subtle edge. And getting to know that is an opening. Because we're usually still holding on. And if we're holding on, there's usually some fear or anxiety in the picture, almost on an energetic level, like a buzz or a tightness, a sense of unstabilized space. And in this subtle place, we can really just rest with it. It's small enough, it's subtle enough, usually. Almost befriend it. Because with all the other energies and qualities that we've developed, you can be safe enough to ride that edge. Because you're not the thing that holds it together. All right, we'll end the meditation. Slowly move your body. If you can, notice how the boundaries come back real sharp, real fast. I'm here, it's there, my body ends here, someone else is talking.